Well, and live we are. Gentlemen, good evening, and also a very warm welcome to Tel Aviv. Christopher, I know although work is based in London, you fled to Germany for these challenging times right now. But before we start, once again, thank you so much for being here. On the right with the white shirt, we have Dan Brami, the co-founder and CEO of Cyabra. You guys are fighting fake news and disinformation out of Tel Aviv. And with us today is also Christopher Keller, who is leading the group business development at The Telegraph, one of the UK's most renowned media houses, if I might say that. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us tonight.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for having us.
Right. Once again, we're gonna talk a little bit about disinformation and the power of truth, or the value of truth in this current situation, but also on a broader spectrum of the digital world. So let's start with I'd say, more general question. The internet has been around for a good while now and has enabled a great access to information and a great democratization of information. What has that done with our society overall done? Maybe if you want to take this first one.
Sure, absolutely. You know, maybe I will switch a little bit with the question and say that I think that what has changed for the last few years is not necessarily the fact that there has or there has not been disinformation. I think this is an issue that has been existing for a very long time, much longer than any could have thought of. Disinformation has been existing way before the internet was here, right? Way before even probably the print media has existed, if I may say so. I think that the major change is the fact that the ones that are creating and disseminating information in a negative way, whether they have a bad intent or not, I think that they have found new methods and new ways of promoting their agenda and amplifying certain topics. I think that's the major change that we see, and so I think that mixed with the democratization of information brings us to an era where it is very difficult to believe in everything that we see or read or listen to, or even in certain senses watch on the TV, because as you can understand, and you know, Christopher, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it's also becoming more and more challenging, even for the news and media conglomerates worldwide, no matter where they are geographically speaking, to have that sort of filtering mechanism to better provide information for the people that consume it, right? For as us, you know, as readers and listeners. So I think it's a triple challenge. It's, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I agree that it's this is not new by any means. You know, fake news has been around for a very, very long time. If you look at how people like Pulitzer made his money, which was basically off the back of selling a lot of fake news, and then ironically now that money funds the Pulitzer Prize for quality journalism. But also, you know, people like Randolph Hearst, who you know, even managed to manipulate public opinion towards the US going to war with Cuba in you know, back in his day. So this is nothing new, but I echo what Dan is saying in that you know, it used to be filtered in a better way. You generally knew. So, for example, with the UK, you always knew that the Telegraph was a conservative newspaper, and so you were being influenced in a conservative way. In the same way, if you read The Guardian, you'd be influenced from left of the centre. And so what a lot of people ended up doing was they read both newspapers, and then they felt well informed. And this is I think what similar behaviours are persisting in the digital space, a lot of informed readers will not just read one source, they'll read many, many different sources to try and form an opinion. But in this to try and signal to the market that we are still trusted brands, trusted voices that somehow try and cut through the noise. That is the only way I think traditional news media will be able to survive going forward.
So now we've spoken a little bit about this issue not being new, but obviously the tools on hand that are being used to just publish information in a wrongful way has obviously dramatically changed. Also, Dan, I would like to get your take on that, because obviously you guys at Cyabra are focusing on these new tools and how to counteract these tools.
Of course. So you know, I'll tell you again, from my very humble opinion, the way that we see the threat of disinformation being presented to the world and even orchestrated in a sense is under three major categories. One of them is those the people creating disinformation, first of all, have the ability to falsify who they are, which is, some people call it, fake identities, bots, sock puppets, trolls, avatars. There's a lot of different ways, and between each and every one of them, you have subcategories for different agendas. But I think that the first category that we see is you can falsify who you are, meaning you don't really have to express your opinion as Dan. You can hide behind the scenes as John or as Martin or as whomever it might be, which is a big problem because people want to echo their opinion based on what the true, genuine consumer opinion means. So that's one category that we see, which is falsifying the identity. And then the second area that we see is the falsification of visual content. We've seen that in multiple occurrences, and not just political occurrences. Please bear that in mind. People usually get the disinformation, it's an election problem. Actually, it's not. It's not. And even if it was only an election problem, to be honest, elections tend to surface and have a tremendous influence over the business world as well. So even if it was only political, it would still influence the commercial world as well. But anyway, so you have the visual manipulation, which is people can generate pictures of me that never existed, of pictures of people that never existed at all, or they can alter the reality through manipulated videos, things that we call deepfakes. And that's a major problem because now you can falsify appearances. And the last but not least, and that's the only one where, again, as Cyabra has not got into as deep as the other two categories, which is the written content. Pretty much saying, people actually call it, allocate that to the world of fact checking or content categorization. But it's the ability to look at a written piece of information. For example, Dan does not drink water. Although, maybe I'm just holding my glass of water, but there's going to be a Facebook post or a tweet that says Dan does not drink water. And so it is really difficult to know whether this is true or not. It's so difficult as a human being. So just imagine how much work there is yet to be done if we were to be developing a technology that could look at that, at a written fact and say, well, that guy or that girl is actually lying. Dan is drinking water. And that's a very big problem in the disinformation world. It's the fact that the entire written content fact-checking aspect is very difficult. And there are so many tools that can counter the very low-level solutions that exist already. that's the entire landscape that I see and what we cover at Cyabra, at least.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Christopher, you tackle the problem of what information you can also publish, what information you can share with your readers, with your consumers, and obviously the quality of your content is a major USP or selling point. So how do you guys tackle it at The Telegraph?
Well, I think Dan made a really important point, which is, the point of identity in the digital space, and we're all used to being able to choose, do I want to go online as myself, or do I want to, try and cloak who I am? And that has, that has very sort of almost benign or semi-benign cases, like someone going onto Twitter with an anonymous fake account and then using that to heckle people, right? That's a common sport that many people seem to do, and that has a whole dynamic in and of itself. I mean, I would not want to be a politician these days. The amount of verbal abuse that is dished out to politicians anonymously via social media is a real problem, and causes mental health issues for the people affected. And then, of course, the same problem is then on the bigger scale, where you've got Russian bots and God knows where these things come from. Trying to influence election campaigns. We saw this massively during the Brexit debate in our country. That's a real issue, because then you suddenly see massive shitstorms and hypes and God knows what kicking off in the social media space, and you don't know whether that is actually genuinely, if that is real humans doing that, and so it's really difficult. I mean, the the difference between just anyone blogging something anonymously and a quality publication is, of course, that we can be taken to court. So we're regulated like any other media company, and we're responsible for what we write, and that is the way it has to be. So if we write something that is wrong, we have to put it right, and we can be taken to court for it. And that in and of itself is a good mechanism, right? Because it does instill some discipline in our trade. And frankly, it's also one of the reasons why a lot of my colleagues have been calling for big platforms like Facebook and others who do curate news, right? If you ask a lot of people these days where they get their news from, they won't give you a traditional news brand. They'll say, "Oh, I get my news from Facebook." And they curate, and there's a lot of power in curation. We've handed these global companies a huge amount of power to do that, but we're not regulating them like traditional news organizations. So that is a big problem, and I think until we solve those two issues, right, the issue of is it okay to be anonymous online, and how do we define identity in the digital space, is one big problem that we have to fix. And the other one is how do we hold those account who are the gatekeepers, the new gatekeepers, right, the emerging and growing gatekeepers of information and curation.
And now we've spoken a bit about the topic of regulatory challenges. We've talked about the topic of identity, but what happens when your identity is somewhat altered? And I mean, Dan, you guys are dealing with that on a daily basis when we're talking about deep fakes. So what can we actually do? Also a little bit maybe from a technical perspective, what can we do to fight these challenges and to fight these I'd say minglers of identity and of information?
Well, I'll say that in a sense, and I love shooting myself in the foot, so I'm going to say this, once and stop it. But I think although we've been building the answer to your question for the last 2 years and I think many more other companies are getting into that world and trying to solve disinformation as a whole and deepfakes. Either way, even if we had the entire technological solution ready to be deployed even 2 years ago and not today, I still think, and that's the part where I actually shoot myself in the foot, I still think that this is not going to be enough to stop the problem entirely. And I think, and that's for very obvious and simple reasons. First of all, because it is sort of a cat and mouse play. And we've seen that for the last 2 years, even at Cyabra, but also out there. We've seen that the methodologies and the approaches that have been implemented in order to skew with the public opinion over time, whether it is political or not, they have gotten more and more complex. When you compare the methodologies implemented back in 2016 or back in 2018 or back in, and God knows, yes, perhaps within the Brexit, and you name it, right? These are just the very well-known examples. I can give, commercial customer examples. The methodologies are getting different, and not just different, but also more complex. Second of all, second reason why I think we as a technological solution are not enough to destroy the problem completely. I will say that eventually we will, and like Christopher said, very, very righteously, the platforms that are sort of the bottleneck between people who want to consume content and information and the ones who are pouring in the information and everything else, the platforms are less regulated. Now, I'm not saying because my dream since I was 6 years old was to regulate platforms. I'm just saying, yes, if you compare the Telegraph or any other major media outlet like the Telegraph, they are much more heavily regulated and with a heavy scrutiny for the last, I don't know, dozens of years probably. And these platforms have such a great power. And so unless there is going to be some sort of, again, this is the way that we see it. Please tell me if you disagree, but I think that technology is only one aspect of that golden triangle, because there's tech and there's regulation that needs to make sure that there's the right overseeing of things. And then the last one is there has to be some sort of partnership with the platforms by themselves, because disinformation is, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, disinformation is bigger than Cyabra, but it's also bigger than Facebook. And even if Facebook has the ability to solve the problem within Facebook, the problem will be solved within Facebook. They won't have the ability to look at other aspects, other platforms. That's why I'm saying the way that we see things, there has to be some sort of triangle that connects between those three dots: tech, regulation for the global oversee, and the platforms individually.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that view, and I think until we, the one point I would probably add to what Dan just said is that even if we had all the technical solutions, even if Facebook solved it and everyone else solved it, we'd still be left with one problem, and that is the human desire to get their confirmation bias from somewhere. People like reading this stuff because it confirms what they believe, and they don't care whether it's true or not. If they're reading it and they already believe it, then that makes it true. And that's why sites like Breitbart and others out there do quite well. They have very loyal readerships. Now they have always existed, right? You've always had, if it wasn't digital, you'd have had some sort of wacky magazine that sold 10,000 copies, and someone would be reading it and then giving it to someone else to read, and it would have been distributed that way. That's always existed, and you're never going to be able to fully get rid of it, right? So I think what we do need to think, however, is how can we make it easier for people to really understand whether something is fake or not. That's the one issue. How can we flag that information? How can we have better checks and balances on that? And then the other one is, how do we stop bad behaviors? And one of those issues will be the identity issue. This touches digital identity touches so many different things. It starts with protecting minors from consuming adult content online, and it goes right through to eventually being able to access government services online, which will happen at some point, more so than it is now, and that is something that we're going to have to really think about going forward.
But is it maybe also a question of education? I mean, yes, legal we have here, we have technical abilities. Is it also on a greater scale, on a greater picture, an educational level to tell our children, to tell people, the general public, to give them the ability to cope with these new developments in the digital realm?
So yes, absolutely, 100%.
Yes.
I think what you'll see is a bifurcation of society along an educational line. So I mean, even really educated people have confirmation bias, right? And but there may be, still reading, hopefully, from a varied number of sources. And most really educated people are used to going out there and they want to do their research and to confirm. But I think the reason you'll see that increasingly is that one of the things that we've seen, of course, is a real change in the advertising landscape, right? And we're seeing this now, with the ongoing crisis. The advertising landscape is, the bottom's fallen out of it, and that's going to really concentrate minds. It is going to concentrate minds in this industry around new business models, and of course, the obvious go-to will be the subscription business model. I personally don't believe it's going to be the only business model, but it will be a dominant one. And one of the things that we have to educate people is that if you're the one paying for it, then you're also the customer, right? And if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer. Right, so you might be a Facebook user, but you are not the customer. You are the product, because you're not paying for it. Right, the people who are paying for it are the customer, and it's the same with news content. So the more I'm paying for it, the greater confidence I can have that what I'm reading is true, and it's been written for me with my interests in mind. Right, so that's why really, really high quality content from research institutes for companies and that sort of stuff. That's really expensive stuff, and it's really good, right? Because that's what you're paying for. And I think subscription models will go the same way. This is why we're going to have a bifurcation. There will be people who will be prepared to pay, expensive subscriptions to the likes of the Telegraph, the Financial Times, and others who are doing a great job in this space. But there'll be everyone else who just consumes it wherever they get it for free. And that I think is the danger, that we then end up getting a disconnect. And the problem is, this is why education is so important, especially in our democracies, right? If more and more people, I think the US is really in trouble here, right? More and more people not well enough educated, not well enough informed, and then going to the voting booth. That's a real problem.
I don't think I have a lot to add. I think that was a magnificent answer. I'll just say, I do have the feeling, and again, this is not part of, this is not part of the commercial business model of any for-profit company, right? That we should go and educate consumers. But interestingly enough, because of the COVID-19 period, for example, now that literally started like a month and a half ago, we did feel like we had to do something. We sort of we were discussing with my co-founders, and we said, you know, I remember 2 years ago when we wanted to create the company, we said we want to do something good for the world, and then all the other things will probably continue and fall off as a domino effect. And sometimes along the way, you actually sometimes forget about this mission statement of wanting to try and do something for a cleaner world, for a more transparent world. And this is the second time I actually shoot myself in the foot. But now I actually have a remedy for this. No, what I'm trying to say is we cannot, unfortunately, pay for providing masks for people in need in different geographical locations. I wish we could, we just can't. I wish we could go out there and provide help to the caregivers and the doctors and everything else. But I don't think they need us without the necessary expertise. What we wanted to do is just go out there, and we started releasing like a weekly episode of disinformation and COVID-19 episodes, and just, you know, highlight something that we think that consumers don't necessarily know. And this is not for a reason because we want to point out to look at the one who, you know, that one person who's responsible. We're not trying to point any fingers at someone. We're actually just trying to say, hey, I don't know if you knew, but if you didn't, our job is also to bring some transparency. So we are obviously not trying to act out as heroes. We're just remembering back what is part of the roots and why we created the company, I guess. It's, you know, just one thing good, I think.
You already touched on your efforts during this current situation. And maybe, Christopher, you also want to share your experiences as a representative of a media outlet. How has the current crisis, and let's just take this current situation as an example of a crisis, not the crisis, but how can we see how the behavior of the consumer changes, especially in a time where he or she is facing major difficulties?
Well, I think what we see is that this crisis, particularly, I mean, any crisis, but this crisis particularly is accelerating patterns and trends that were already there before, right? So this is, for example, at the geopolitical level, you know, the fact that China's been on the rise for a long time is no secret, but that is really being accelerated. I mean, we may actually find ourselves coming out of this corona crisis into a world where China is potentially the dominant superpower, right? And the US is the number two, which will cause all kinds of problems. The US won't like that. Europe will find themselves caught between those two chairs. And that'll be really interesting to play out. From a media perspective, of course, that's great because it gives us lots to write about. But the same, you know, if you can also boil that down to the consumer level, we also see, you know, we've seen a massive shift from print to digital, which of course is most important for a newspaper. And we may see that shift really accelerate because, you know, newspapers as a physical product are probably not, you know, necessarily safe product. Well, I mean, they're perfectly safe, but in a world where everyone's worried about washing their hands and spraying germs around the place, you know, a digital product just has advantages that you don't have to touch it. And also the places where those newspapers get sold, like news agents and this sort of stuff, you know, they may really lose out from this. So I think the wise thing to do right now, especially for, you know, any business owner and anyone looking into the future here, is now really to think about which are the trends that are going to be accelerating, and that is something we all need to do. We need to do as publishers, but any business needs to do, because that's where there will be, I think, huge opportunities for growth for businesses out there when we come out of this crisis. but only if we learn the right lessons. I think there's a question in the Q&A, by the way, from Romana on, do we believe that the platforms should be responsible against fake news, or whether there should be tools for the end users to check facts and check fake news? But I think that's probably a best one for you, Dan.
I'll do my best, but I think you could actually provide maybe another angle than mine, or maybe we will just agree with each other. But I think that to a certain degree, yes, the social media platforms, whomever they might be, I think they are responsible to implement mechanisms that make the platforms a safer, healthier, and slightly more transparent place than where we are currently. And then I'll say that with a small asterisk on the side, and say that when we compare the platforms that are existing nowadays, the same Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and any other one, a major one, when we compare them to what they were a few years ago, good steps to try and improve that. Now, good steps for some people might seem like not enough, and for some other organizations or even governments seem like they are on the right path of creating that, overseeing an overview of the platforms. I think that, again, there has to be some sort of responsibility, almost like a spider sense, right? If they were like a spider tingling thing, they have to do better. And also, and that's a little bit related to what you said, Christopher. And then I can give you the mic, but if they do their job at filtering out slightly better the disinformation and fake news problems, it will eventually force them to shift into a new business model, or maybe change it a little bit. And when we say change it a little bit, for companies that are making billions a year, that has a very large repercussion of who they are and what are the actions that lead to the change. So yes, the short answer is yes, by the way.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think I agree. I think there's a lot that we can do as an industry around the outside to develop the things you're doing, Dan, and others, to make sure that we address the problem. But I am a fervent believer that ultimately these tech companies have to be regulated in a different way. I don't see a way around that, to be honest. And I think we need to have a really honest conversation also about their business model, right? And to what degree, collecting so much data and information for advertising is healthy. Now, the one issue we all talk about the whole time is collecting data and then manipulating people's political opinions, which is a very touchy subject. The one we don't really talk about is, how we're manipulating people to desire a product and these other things. And when the manipulation gets too negative, in the sense that you're creating anxieties in people, right? If you're creating anxieties that people have regarding their own self-image, body image, and all the rest of these things, we're straying into the territory of mental health disorders here, and that's where I think the advertising industry as a whole really has to start thinking whether this is, whether maybe we even need some ethical guidelines here. When you see, how many. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a psychologist, and you know, she's been in this profession for a long time, and you know, 10 years ago, she mainly had sort of middle-aged people come in with midlife crisis issues. Now she has predominantly men, age 23, around that age, come in with you know, severe mental health issues. And I'm you know, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that actually can be traced back to really bad you know, manipulation that comes from the advertising industry.
Well, if I may summarize here, guys, because we're running a little bit late when it comes to the timing, there has been a big call for legal, for technological and educational solutions. So if you could summarize a message and a thought that you would like to give to us, to the audience, for the future of information, what steps need to be taken, just in a few summarizing sentences, to preserve this valuable good of rightful information in the future. Christopher.
Should I go first? Okay. Okay, Christopher, please.
Okay. So I think it starts with identity, as we said at the beginning of this conversation. It's not only important what you're saying, but it's also really important who's saying it. I think we need to have a really open, honest, frank conversation about how we're going to treat identity in the digital space going forward. We need to have this in the West. We need to have this in our democracies, because, by the way, you know, countries like China are already figuring all this out, and that they might be doing it in a way that does not conform with our values. So we need to figure out how we're going to do that going forward. I think that's point number one. Point number two is we need to educate people to really see the value in curation and the power that curation has. Whether it's an algorithm doing it or a human doing it is not that important. The importance is where you're getting it from, and we need to educate them to understand that you know, if they're getting it for free, they really have to watch what they trust. And then I think the third element that we need to get right, and this is all along the lines of you know, fact checking, but also
Right.
Uncovering deepfakes. This is almost, I think, a new strand of investigative journalism that we need to, you know, teach as a discipline in the journalistic space. And
If you
you
guys,
know, I'm sorry.
if you guys didn't hear me, internet is blowing up.
Message, and that's usually the message that I give to my mom. Sometimes, you know, I find her, you know, like sharing and like resharing a piece of content, an article or stuff like that, and a few of the times it seems, you know, off. Something's gray, right? And so I tell my mom, listen, before you, and I know you have no bad intent. Of course, I know you're my mother, no worries. But before you share it with your friends and your family members, I think you should remember that there are other players that could eventually have the ability to influence over your opinion. So before you do that and you press the share button, and that probably takes an additional 10 to 15 seconds. And that's nothing, by the way, as compared to you know, if that's something that is interesting for you and for your surroundings, adding an additional 10 to 15 seconds and really thinking whether you should share something and whether it makes sense, what I just read, and not just, and that's, you know, highly aligned with what you said, Christopher. People are interested in things that are eyeballs grabbing and not necessarily trustworthy. And that's a very big problem. And so that's what I say to my mother, and that's what I say to myself every time I read something now. Just take an additional 10 seconds and just look and just think whether it makes, first of all, it makes true sense. If it doesn't, maybe you should, read other articles and see whether there's some sort of a straight line of opinion and agenda between different media outlets or not. And second of all, yes, related to the identity, if the difference between influenced by someone or not on a platform could be to actually accept a friend invitation on Facebook. That could be the very slight difference, and that's only one click away. So that's my second advice. Even the small things like accepting a friendship of someone that you say, well, if we have 4 mutual friends, why don't we become friends too? I think that's probably less than 15 seconds to double check that. And that could be a big difference between being influenced or not by someone you don't necessarily know.
Well, guys, on that note, I really have to thank you. It was a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your thoughts. Best wishes to Tel Aviv. Dan, thank you so much. Best wishes to somewhere in Germany.
Thank you for organizing that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Guys, have a great evening. And to all listeners, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Have a great evening, guys.
Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.